Thank you, Nicole. Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, it's a very fruitful and insightful discussion so far. The next session will be more practical about strategies to rebalance the market power. As Nicole mentioned, we will have 4 panelists. 2 will be online, 2 will be sitting here with me. So let me just call them up to the stage. Ms. Paula Fray from South African Media and Digital Platforms Market Inquiry, the Competition Commission of South Africa. And Ms. Martha Dark, co-founder and co-director of Foxglove from the UK. And joining us online will be Karen Rønde, the CEO of Danish Press Publishers CMO, first CMO's collective management office organization, from Denmark. She will start the conversation explaining how the collective negotiation works in Denmark. I heard that now almost 99% of the publishers in Denmark have joined the CMO and they have started negotiations with AI platforms. And we will also have online Ms. Courtney Radsch, the director of Center for Journalism and Liberty for the Open Market Institute, joining us from the US. So we'll start with Ms. Karen. I hope the video can be uploaded and can be displayed. As you all recognize, so we'll have 3 use cases, three stories from Karen, from Paula, and from Martha that will describe 3 different strategies to reclaim market power for us in the media industry. So 3 different strategies: collective bargaining, litigation, and also Competition Commission market inquiry that just released their finding, I think last week. So 3 different strategies, and we'll discuss that. And then Courtney will give her assessment why it's important to try to push our effort in rebalancing the market and push for tech accountability in that regards. Do we have the video? Let's start with Ms. Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen. I'm the CEO of the Danish Press Publications Collective Management Organization. It's a great pleasure talking to you today. Denmark is a small country in a global world. And if the Danish press publishers should have a chance against big tech with the new neighboring rights in Europe and get licenses, we needed to join forces, all of us. Because our collective cooperation is not just about financial survival. It's about safeguarding our democracy. So the mission we share goes beyond individual media outlets, because we fight for truth and accountability to serve the public good above all. So our logic is simple. When we join forces, we all stand a better chance of success, both collectively and individually. So today we represent 99% of the Danish media industry, including the state-owned public service broadcasters, and we are approved by the Minister for Culture. Our mandate covers the neighboring rights, but also text and data mining, and it includes enforcement. When we started in 2021, our approach was very open-minded and pragmatic. We reached out to the global tech companies because we wanted partnerships. We were curious, we wanted to learn from the technology, their data, and we wanted to get insight into the business model. But we soon realized it takes 2 to tango. Many big tech companies didn't want to prioritize Denmark. They didn't want to enter into license agreement with us. Today, we have interim license agreement in place with all the search engines available on the Danish market. But we struggle with social media, and we also struggle with Apple and the AI companies. And that is why we have tried to enforce our rights when they will not negotiate with us. So today, we have had cases against Meta, TikTok, OpenAI, and Gemini in relation to mediation, where we involved the Danish Minister of Culture. We tried arbitration. They didn't want to participate, so we involved the Minister of Culture. We have filed complaints against Meta and Instagram and TikTok. We have filed complaints against Facebook. We have filed a report to the police against Apple. And we have a lot of pending parallel cases because we want to showcase to the policymakers that our enforcement tools are not effective in practice when it comes to global tech. We have also involved consumer authorities, competition authorities, the Nordic Council of Europe, to show them how we work in practice with a new legal framework and how difficult it is to implement it in practice. We also have entered into license agreement and cooperation with the global partners that actually acknowledge that reliable journalism, is worth protecting. So we have entered into letter of intent and pilot agreements with, for example, Moderator. We have cooperations with the national LLMs where we want to license our content because we want to contribute to create alternatives to big tech solutions. We have entered into a letter of intent with Cloudflare because we want to showcase that we want to protect our content efficiently to force big tech to the negotiation table. Our learnings has been so far that we can't just focus on licensing or litigation. We need to work with a lot of parallel tracks, actually 6. The first one is, of course, licensing. That's why we are here. Value begins at the source. Our top priority is fair remuneration and data access. Number 2, legislation. We must set the rule, of course, for a fair game. We work with governments, policymakers, and civil servants on a national, European, and global level. We need strong, clear laws that respect creative rights. And we also need to contribute with concrete proposals when the current legislation fails. And that is why we in Denmark and Europe have suggested opt-in models, reversal of burden of proof, and that we should introduce a final of arbitration model as we have in Australia, Canada, and the UK. 3, literacy. We must win minds and hearts to create lasting change. We have increased our collaboration, including cross-sectoral, cross-border cooperation with academia, NGOs, interest group, industry organization, consumer organization, civil rights organization, and youth organization. We have established a nationwide conversation relay together with a national enlightenment organization and Danish media industry, where we listen and visit NGOs, school organization, kids organization representing disabled people. 4, leadership. To shape change, someone must take the lead and be willing to take risk. 5, leveraging. As in leveraging new technologies and innovation. We must analyze all the tools we also know from other industry areas, as must carry, must offer, cultural contribution regimes, private levy regimes, digital taxes, and we must have an open-minded discussion around creating new tools. We must continue focusing on citizens' accessibility and findability of public interest content. And 6, litigation. Rights without effective enforcement are just wishes. So when our rights are violated, enforcement is necessary. And that is why we have decided to sue OpenAI and LinkedIn. Our learnings have been so far that enforcement and policy goes hand in hand, because when we try enforcement in practice and it doesn't work, we can show to the policymakers and civil servants that our enforcement tools are not sufficient in this AI and digital age. And finally, our story to the people must be a story of hope, a story that lifts people up, that shows it's possible to act and change things when we believe in each other and collaborate, and of course, take concrete actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we have Ms. Karen here joining us, so we will have some conversation afterwards. And Courtney, welcome as well. But before that, I would like to give opportunity to Paula Fray the panel member of South African Media and Digital Platform Market Inquiry. I think you set a benchmark across the globe for this kind of legal challenge, and please update us on the latest development in South Africa.
Thank you very much. In fact, this is hot off the presses, so to speak. We actually released our report on Thursday. It was gazetted on Friday. And so it's a 2-year process. The Competition Commission inquiry started in September 2023. And I think its value really lay in the fact that it's an evidence-based participatory approach. I mean, if you look at how we conducted the inquiry, we had 5 rounds of submissions, responses for information. We had extensive public hearings. We had confidential hearings. We had follow-up hearings and post-submissions. And then we had very, very strong engagement with both stakeholders in the media and also the platforms. And I think that is a defining thing for me about our inquiry. I should just explain that I'm not a member of the Competition Commission. I am actually a media expert who was co-opted onto the panel. I've been a journalist since 1986 and entered journalism when we were shifting from typewriters to computers. So you can imagine that this is quite a highlight for my career. I also want to say that the other thing that really defines the Competition Commission's inquiry was that it was really placed within the framework of the Constitution. South Africa is a constitutional democracy, and so if you think that the media is essential for democracy, then you really need to talk about how we sustain it. And so while this was a market inquiry, it was also about looking at sustaining the media long term. I think that the transparency of the process, the fact that people could actually watch the public hearings, that there was an ongoing discussion, helped shift the conversation from, shift the public conversation to grievances, from anecdotes to evidence, to actually looking towards remedy. I mean, it was really an interesting process for me to be able to, when people said, well, this is how the platforms actually impact on us as a media, we said, well, that's interesting. Where is the evidence, right? I mean, don't tell us that you're losing search or clicks, show us the evidence. And that really helped us in the process, because as you heard earlier on, in the end, we ended up with a negotiated settlement that allowed the media to almost immediately to be able to receive funds and to move on. I think the other issue, and I want to share this as particularly with media from the rest of the continent, is that national context really matters. I mean, we weren't the first Competition Commission to look at the impact of the platforms on media, but what we did say was we have a very different context to Canada, to Australia, to anyone else, and we really need to be looking at the impact that they're having on our conversation and our ability to perform our constitutional duty. And I think one of the things that I need to explain to you is that in South Africa, the media consumption really depends on who you are. And so if you're wealthy, you really are more likely to be searching for your news and information. And so search function becomes really important. But the Competition Commission actually commissioned its own survey into media consumption that really reinforced the huge impact of social media on our news consumption. And so what we're looking at is the majority of South Africans getting their news and information from social media and from the public broadcaster. And when you look at the rest of at other competition commissions, the public broadcaster was not necessarily kind of identified as a key stakeholder. And it certainly was, in the South African context, a very, very key stakeholder that we looked at. And the other issue is that when we think of the internet, we think English because that's just generally the language of the internet. But in South Africa, people, we have 9 official languages, and so, you know, the range of languages that people use is quite important to recognize. And so we look particularly at community media and vernacular media and what the impact was on them. During the public hearings, for example, the Association of Independent Publishers told us that their members were more likely to have a Facebook page than a website. And so you need to really consider that and consider how you give people access to news and information in that environment. And then to really look at I want to just stress that I think that mainstream media is critical, that large media houses are quite important because they're more likely to do the kind of investigations that have an impact on our society. But equally important is the small community media that's serving a couple of thousand people in a community where they do the local investigations, etc. And so I think that's a starting point. National context is important. The other thing that is important is regulatory collaboration, that during the whole process, we didn't just kind of think of what remedies we were going to impose, but who do we need to be talking to? And so we spoke with other departments, other government departments. We spoke with, to really kind of look at how you take this movement forward and ensure. The Competition Commission can't impose remedies on government, but it can certainly make recommendations to government, and we did. I mean, one of the things that you need to think about, if media is important for democracy, then what role does government play and what role does business play? And in both of those cases, we made recommendations that business must be more actively involved in supporting media if we think it's important, and that certainly government could also support media efforts when it comes to things like looking for tax incentives or for looking for ways to support it. I do think that in the end, with our negotiated settlement, I think that we had some meaningful agreements. I'm sure that the media would like to see bigger amounts, and I wouldn't blame them. But the reality is that we can almost immediately begin to look at those remedies and begin to implement them. And because it is a Competition Commission inquiry, to be able to make sure that, in fact, the platforms live up to their commitments. I mean, one of the things, and I bring this up because I know that, the Google Showcase is one of the mechanisms that we're using, except in this particular case, Google will have to report back in terms of who they've signed with, what the amounts are, and that we can actually then monitor. And so it's not a matter of, if you don't comply, we'll take it away, because, in fact, they have to deliver a certain amount for every year. And that speaks also to the whole process of transparency and accountability. The fact that it is a Competition Commission means that we had access to financials, to actual data around numbers, etc. And I think that is so important just in terms of making decisions. And then just going forward, I think ongoing monitoring obviously is quite important, because the remedies themselves are there to ensure that they evolve with market dynamics. I do want to say that, the idea of it simply being a revenue transfer is also something that we need to think about. Because if you look at it, I mean, in almost all the media coverage, and South Africans will know this, it's the fact that Google has to pay 688 million, which is not a small amount of money, but that's been the main story. But in fact, there's detail in our report that seeks to fix the market. And I'll give you some examples. One of the things that we found was that if you search for a story in South Africa, you're just as likely to get a foreign source. So you'll get a story from The Guardian before you get a South African story. In one particular case, it was a fake Indian website that was like kind of taking news from the Chinese news agency that was taking stories from South African news agency, and that's a story that actually came up when you Google searched it. And so one of the remedies actually that Google has agreed to is to launch and then market a local source preference. So you can actually go and say to Google, when I'm searching, these are my preferred websites that I want, and that to deal with that. But also the issue of the social media houses deprecating deprioritizing news. One of the remedies is for Meta to give media ad credits that will allow them to actually promote their media Facebook pages, for example, that will then shift them into the monetization zone. And all the social media platforms have agreed to support South African media houses with monetization strategies. So I think that what we really kind of have a look at is that looking at our own context, providing evidence for our context, and then actually putting forward remedies that deal with the context. I'm happy to answer more questions.
Thank you, Paula. So just one question before we move on to Martha. What happens now? Is the remedies final and binding? I heard there's also some digital platforms that refuse or did not engage with the process?
So we reached agreement with almost everyone. We've imposed remedies on X, and so there's a 20-day period in which people can object to the report, and then we'll move forward from there.
Great, thank you. So we'll elaborate more on that strategy from South Africa. We heard from Denmark, and now from Martha, litigation and legal challenge. Can you share what you learned from the processes?
Sure. I'm Martha. I'm from a group called Foxglove. We are not journalists, but we bring cases against big tech companies mostly in labour, anti-monopoly, and the climate space. And we, obviously, as we've heard this morning, AI threatens and has a huge impact on news in all sorts of different ways, but we have focused on one in particular, which is generative AI. And we're working with journalists and publishers and international partners to challenge Google's theft of news through its generative AI summaries, AI overviews. And I think everybody in this room will already know what they are, but just to explain what they are and why they're a problem. In the past, obviously, when you Google something, you'd be presented with a series of links that link through to original news content or source content. Now what you're presented with is a Google summary of all of that content that's created based on information scraped from across the internet and from newsrooms. And all of the original links are pushed below that, which has a huge impact on, obviously, the number of people that click on the links, which is a very big problem for outlets that rely on ad revenue from search results. And at the moment, Google will let publishers opt out of having their data scraped for AI summaries only if they agree to be delisted from Google, which when Google has a 95% monopoly share on search, that is essentially being removed from the internet. And we obviously believe that is an outrageous abuse of monopoly power and the kind of behaviour that competition regulators should be imposing structural remedies to stop, given the existential threat that it is to news. And I think we all also know that big tech, from past experience, is not ever going to change because they feel like it or because of the good of their heart. And so I think there's a really important role for competition regulators to play in terms of forcing them to change. And so, I think we've talked a bit about this today already, but lots of the bigger publishers are trying to cut deals to avoid the worst impact of this. But smaller, independent and specialist outlets don't have that kind of bargaining power in the context of Google. And that's why we've been filing with actually lots of the people in this room, multiple complaints to competition regulators across the world, asking regulators to urgently act to force Google to allow publishers to opt out of AI scraping, but without being removed from search. I'm not sure that that's the complete solution to the problem, but I certainly think it creates a more level playing field from which negotiations can happen. And so far we've filed in the EU, in South Africa, Italy, the UK, and the US, and with partners we're preparing to file in Brazil. And across all of the jurisdictions, the argument is very simple, which is Google is abusing its dominant power by taking journalists' work to fuel AI overviews without permission or compensation and then harming ad revenue globally and damaging democracy. But to just go to something Paula was just saying, and I think has been a theme throughout the day, obviously Google is a global company and this requires a very global response, I think. And international legal work is only ever, in my view, effective when there's mobilization across borders. And I think the media industry also has a really crucial role to play in this. One of the challenges with all of this is that Google has a lot of information about the impact that this has on ad revenue and chooses not to disclose it. So we've been working with different kind of researchers and investigators, and some of the outcomes of the research of the impact has been that some newsrooms are reporting 50 to 70% of decline in ad revenue since AI overviews have come in, which is a huge amount of money if that's a huge source of income. And so I think the good news in all of this is that this isn't something that any of us are completely powerless in. I think actually there is a real moment for international solidarity and collaboration between regulators, between newsrooms, between publishers, to kind of join us if anyone would like to. This is a totally open invite. If anyone is interested in challenging this in jurisdictions in which you work, we're really open to like either sharing the complaints that we've made so that they can be useful, or working together with other partners to file further complaints.
Thank you, Martha. What factors that you think are important to make sure that the legal challenge can be accepted, can be successful? What are the data or evidence needed in the country when you file that legal challenge?
Yeah, so like I said, one of the main challenges that we've been experiencing so far is that it's taking quite a lot of work to evidence the harm, because Google knows the extent to which AIO impacts ad revenue, but it's very difficult to get that information. So we've been working with a group called Authoritas, who's already done a assessment of the impact in the UK and in parts of the EU and in Brazil. And so it's really important that newsrooms, I think, are also evidencing that harm so that we have a better kind of database from which to prove the harm. But also, like, so far, no regulator has taken action on this. And I think, you know, the most progressive response that we've seen to this issue is South Africa. I think the provisional report that you put out did include the fact that this opt-out must exist. But we're yet to see a regulator impose it. And I think it will be very difficult for any one regulator to be able to do this alone. So actually, there's a huge amount of work that needs to happen, not by us, but by by regulators around the world who are trying to address the same issue. But also, I think one of the challenges to it is that it is difficult for the media industry to have a united response to this in a moment where the most powerful players are cutting deals. And I completely understand why, like Google is as big and powerful as it is, but that means it's not such a level playing field for the smaller independent outlets. And I think there's a lot that needs to be done to kind of unify both of those different types of organization.
Thank you. Courtney, you've been researching these strategies and case studies all over the world. Can you give us your insight on this? Why this market-based solution is important, and what's the roadmap moving forward?
Sure. Thanks so much. I think it's really critical to understand that, like, business models don't just exist out in the ether to go find, right? They exist in markets. And so we're seeing a pretty, I think, important confluence of factors right now where you have competition inquiries and cases around the world that have established the monopoly of several of the companies that are at the forefront of AI development. So that includes Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, et cetera. And that provides an opportunity to impose structural and behavioral remedies. So, for example, this idea that that Google has essentially bundled all of its AI crawlers into one indistinguishable crawler means that you can't effectively opt out of AI crawling if you don't want to opt out of AI search. So, you know, we can look to cases, which is what we, you know, tried in the US illegal monopoly case with Google search, to say, you know, we need to unbundle those and prevent retaliatory discrimination. So if you decide to block the, you know, AI crawling bot, that you don't also then get penalized and discriminated against by the Google search bot. So that's like a pretty easy behavioral remedy that could either be imposed because of an illegal monopoly or through these competition inquiries in order to mitigate the creation of monopoly. I think similarly, we're seeing, you know, a lot of copyright cases, but the vast majority of them are in the United States, where we have a very permissive fair use law that has so far, you know, it's really unclear how the courts are going to come down on fair use and whether that's going to apply the same way to training as it does to grounding and retrieval augmented generation. And I think we need to see a lot more cases. And I know we've worked with Foxglove before, and I think it's great to see that we're doing more of these because every country has a copyright law. And for the most part, according to an analysis that we did of all of the countries that have or are looking at news media bargaining style legislation and their copyright law, for the most part, this is not a fair use or a fair dealing, because most copyright laws have a market replacement factor. And the fact is we know there's a market for journalism data. We know that, not just journalism, but all of this content, because you have deals that are being made. You have a dozen firms that have showed up to help facilitate deal making and licensing. And you have, organizations like Karen's that are literally facilitating those for the whole industry. So I think we need to, someone was mentioning earlier about, shifting these narratives. Like, there is this sense of inevitability and we can't go back. But the problem is we're only going faster and faster to this nebulous idea of innovation when we have not talked about what are we innovating towards. We haven't talked about innovation for more democratic or just societies, more environmentally sustainable world. No, we're just talking about this nebulous idea of competition, for innovation and competition, with other nation states, as if somehow we're not competing to become, to destroy kind of the sectors on which this entire AI system is built. And so I think one of the things we should see more of from this community is submitting to competition authorities that are doing these inquiries. So, the South African Commission is, I wish we made laws that way in the US. I mean, the level of engagement and interest they had in gathering evidence and hearing from experts was really amazing. Brazil had an inquiry that I think it just closed, looking at what is the impact of Google on the news ecosystem. So the UK had a consultation on AI and copyright, and on whether it should designate Apple and Google as having strategic market status. These things are all interrelated, and they are opportunities for us to provide evidence of the decline in traffic, the fact that these bots are not respecting our, instructions, the fact that there is no meaningful opt-out requirement. And I think that we need to be proactive in proposing legislation. So there's a lot of discussion around transparency. So transparency around, the training data sources, which fulfill a lot of interests, not just our own interest in, as rights holders, but also for safety issues, for understanding how propaganda and disinformation is getting, wrapped up into these products, which we know from the research that it is, because it's freely available online. We also need transparency about bots. And this is where I'd love to see, I think there's an opportunity in South Africa with the Competition Commission, but also in, countries around the world to propose legislation to require, know your bot type of legislation, require companies to report what bots are they using, disaggregate, purpose-driven bots so that we can garner more control. And we need collective management organizations. We need to look at what the music industry did, where it's not up to every individual artist to track when a radio station plays their music and go out and get that money. No, there are, ways of creating, differences between performance rights and licensing. We can look at the same idea for training and RAG. We know that journalism is needed to keep these models updated, a small but, important part of the system. And what I worry about is that if we don't get on, if we don't rebalance some of the power here, we're already seeing tech companies just replace journalism. And there was a discussion earlier about like tech companies with journalism in their DNA. What I am seeing and reporting on right now are tech companies that don't care about journalism, but they need it because they just need more data. And so they're going out and starting up local newsrooms that will take, use their AI product to take information from YouTube and other news feeds and public data and have one editor kind of in charge of 20 different newsrooms so that they can, provide news to those communities. And that might be better than nothing, but we do need to address the fact, I think, as was discussed on the last panel, like the news industry is changing and you can't send AI in to, interview somebody in prison or, have that discussion to cultivate that confidential source. So we definitely need to double down on the value of journalism as a process and set of commitments. And I think be very careful about how we integrate the generative AI tools into content production.
Thank you, Courtney. Before I open it up to the floor, just one question for Karen. You mentioned that you work on the CMO model since 2021 and now managed to get almost 100%. I wonder who's the 1% who was not included in the collective. How did you manage to gather that many support? Because as you know, there is a asymmetry bargaining position between publishers and platforms. Usually publishers are really dependent on platforms in terms of distribution, sharing revenue, etc. How do you do it in Denmark?
Yeah, good question. It was not easy. When we started trying to unite the industry, there was a lot of different interest. For example, the digital startups, they had great cooperation in place with big tech. So they actually feared that their rights and their partnerships would be jeopardized by, joining this CMO. There was also a lot of different interest between the private-owned companies and the state-owned public service broadcasters because they have a lot of history also in Denmark and cases actually against each other. So the focus was, to create a kind of trust between all members, that this was, about democracy and that the task is so big that we need to unite to lift this one. And I think, after many talks, it took over half a year with a lot of discussions, a lot of meetings with each individual media outlets. We created the statute. And in the statutes, it's mentioned that, when it comes to distribution of revenue, it is acknowledged that, we will take an amount and share equally among all members, no matter the size. And that was actually, to acknowledge also the small one, the regional one, the local ones, and the digital startups. So it was much about creating trust and that our focus was actually partnerships from the beginning.
Thank you. I think that's really, really insightful. And now I think let's hear it from the floor. We have one from Isaac. Please hand the mic to Isaac, and then it's still open for other questions regarding these 3 case studies. Please, Isaac.
My name is Isaac Menar. I'm from South Africa, and I was part of the Media and Civil Society group to put pressure on the Competition Commission to do the right thing. And they have largely, I think, succeeded in that. One particular thing that we pushed right from the start was that the inquiry had to be conducted not only in terms of competition law, but in terms of human rights framework. We also made a point to say that the role of news as a public good or credible news should be highlighted as opposed to just any news. And I think maybe Paula can explain a bit how did they actually succeed in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Yeah, there's 2 more from Maya and Umpa. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Great session. I have one more specific question. Like, we've been involved in the Competition Commission discussions in Brazil, but also in the AI bill, and we are seeing the possibility of approving it. And with that comes the challenge of thinking how we're going to guarantee the compensation. So I wanted to know from this panel if you have seen in the debates you guys are having, and also from Karen a bit more about the framework she's thinking about in these negotiations regarding collective management and how we can get the money to the organizations and models and frameworks we have seen. Courtney talked about the music industry. In Brazil, we've seen collective management in the culture sector like for a very long time. But we know that there are also challenges and inequalities that these sectors reproduce. And how can we learn from these processes and try to develop something new and better for journalism? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Umpa.
I'm Ompa from the Media Leadership Think Tank in South Africa. My question is to Paula as well as, sorry, I forgot your name, Foxglove, on the negotiated settlements, right? I'll put in the African context. In Nigeria, the government also settled. In South Africa, we seemingly see that there was a negotiated settlement that resulted in big tech somewhat agreeing to the terms and conditions from the Competition Commission. My question is, are these regulatory frameworks are they not becoming a framework for when we're dealing with big tech? Are these negotiated regulatory frameworks between global platforms and domestic regulators truly about shared governance, or are they just a polite way of cementing big tech's dominance within the global south, considering that the same thing or the same approach is not done in the global north?
I think we have one more. Yes, please.
Hi, Justin from Code for Africa. Just a quick question that we focused very much on journalistic media. Have there been any attempts to reach out to other kinds of media, for example, book publishers, and other kinds of publishers, academic and so forth, that are facing the same kind of cannibalization or kind of strip mining of their content, to join forces there? So that's the one question. The second question is that we're very focused on remedial measures to protect the content, when the second big disruption to at least journalistic media is around the advertising model. So are there any successful attempts at looking at tithing or taxing advertising, online advertising, as a more sustainable way of kind of plowing money back into content creation? And that's because while platforms have proven that they try and step away from content, like we've seen in Canada and elsewhere, they're not stepping back from advertising in any way.
Great question. Okay, I think Courtney can address that. Yeah, let's start with Paula. What can you share us the processes that Isaac mentioned?
Thank you very much. I mean, Isaac, as you know, there was a lot of debate about the definition of news during the Competition Commission, with the platforms trying to restrict it, to make it very, very specific, and really the Commission arguing, or the panel arguing, that product created by credible media was news. So if a publisher produced lifestyle or sports, that would also be news under this definition. But just in terms of news as a public good, so the Competition Commission was within the framework of the Constitution and people's rights in South Africa, and so people's right to information, to be able to be active citizens. But in terms of news as a public good, if you look at the remedies, they are specific to media that are members of either the Press Council of South Africa or fall under the Broadcasting Complaints Commission, so licensed broadcasters. And I think just in terms of that was to kind of say, so not anyone who produces content is covered by this, but people who produce public service journalism or public service information would fall within that. I want to just talk about the issue of the settlement. When I said that it was a settlement, I think I should just clarify that we produced a provisional report. And in that provisional report allowed people to make representation to whether or not they thought we'd got something wrong, or that they disagreed, or added value, or etc. And so it was that report and the remedies from that report that we eventually produced a final kind of agreement with the platforms. The benefit of that, in my view, is that we you know, I mean, I think that the panel chair, James Hodge, actually mentioned this. You know, South Africa is a very small fry in the big scheme of things, just in terms of the consumption, the clicks, the income generated, etc. And I'd like to think that we're actually punched, you know, way above our weight. You know, it kind of like prove that even a small country like ours can make big waves. And so this is not, to be absolute, this is not reparations for past harm. This is a market inquiry. It's here and now. And it doesn't mean that media, if they can, you know, can't actually act on that. I mean, that is a different process altogether. That's a tribunal. This is a market inquiry. And so the advantage of actually having a settlement and going there is that we avoid litigation and we allow media to actually get compensated really quickly and move forward.
Thank you. While we are on the subject, Martha, can you also comment on Umpa's questions?
So if it's okay, I was going to answer the question about the regulatory frameworks that you asked. Competition regulators have the power to impose structural remedies, and in the context of companies as big tech, fines mean very little. They're pocket change, and currently what newsrooms are getting is the sort of crumbs from the banquet, and unless someone like a competition regulator steps in and imposes a structural change, that will continue. And I think that's true in any context, whether that's global north or global south. I think the fines don't matter anywhere. And so, or them having to pay monetary compensation without forcing a change to the structure of the business model. So I think all of this in the context of encouraging regulators to think about the issue differently is trying to set things up differently in the future rather than just what's come before, which is they pay a fine and continue to act in the way that they always have.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Yeah. Courtney, involving book publishers and advertising tax?
Yeah, and I mean, I would just emphasize, I think that we have to see structural remedies. Otherwise, even, you know, $1 billion fine, it's just going to get litigated, and good luck collecting it, much less if you're not Europe. You know, no one else is really going to have that opportunity. But we do see that there are some structural remedies being proposed in the ad tech case. And one of the things that I like, it's not a structural remedy, but one of the remedies, and it goes to the question around the ad tech and taxing. I'm not a huge fan of taxing. I mean, it's certainly an approach, but it's very easy to divert taxes, to choose winners and losers, et cetera, or get different priorities from a government. Although I think it can make sense looking at information pollution, the way we taxed, you know, tobacco, for example, is taxed very highly in the US, and some of that goes to education. We could look at doing the same for like information literacy. But one of the remedies in the ad tech trial was initially to pay publishers for the cost of moving from Google's monopolistic ad tech platform to an alternative, which is great, but like very insufficient. So we wrote a letter and we're like, why don't you create an escrow account for additional costs? And I think that this idea of either restitution, but also then the costs of monopoly is something that holds some promise for getting money directly to publishers, more so than taxing and then hoping that you can get some publishers to get that tax when like every business wants part of the tax, the digital tax credits. And right now you have threats from the Trump administration that any taxes on US firms amount to being anti-American or a form of censorship and anti-Americanism. So that's going to be really politically difficult to do. I mean, all of this is increasingly politically challenging in the face of threats that equate regulation of digital platforms and information ecosystems with censorship and anti-Americanism. But in terms of joining forces with other creators, we have seen in the UK, for example, the Creative AI Coalition includes musicians, it includes publishers of all different types. And that's been very powerful because then you have people like, anyways, I'm not going to name names, but big musicians that are out there and have an audience that can get them to care about this. I think similarly, we need to see more of that in the US because what happens here will impact the rest of the world. And it's just, I'm always so in awe of Karen getting 99% of news publishers. Here we have like tiny coalitions where we have some SAG-AFTRA, so we have like some of the entertainment industry, we have some of the creative industries, some of the publishing, but we do not have anything approaching what Karen has been able to build in Denmark. And I think part of that, and as particularly a challenge for journalism, is that they see, first of all, some people can't wrap their head around the fact that like journalism isn't just a collection of facts and therefore does have, some rights. And also they, journalists see themselves as having a public interest. And so it's hard for them to decide to say, put their content off limits to the AI crawlers or to these systems when this is how people are getting their information. And we know it degrades the quality, but I kind of feel like we might have to take some short-term pain in order to ensure that there are products created that are, safe and help improve democracy and information resilience. Because right now, the error rates, there was a BBC study, 46% error rate, or what the industry jargon calls hallucinations in news production on chatbots. So, I think there's a lot that we need to do, and we need to definitely join forces with the creative community because we're not enough on our own.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. Last word, Karen. Question from Maya about the framework, successful framework and model to engage the tech platforms.
Yes, what we did when it comes to the framework, compensation framework, is that we did a benchmark to the music industry licensing regime in Denmark and to the video licensing regime. And then we ended up with, a percentage of 5% of the ad revenue would be a fair exchange of value. And of course, they will not, big tech, especially Google, will not acknowledge that because then they're going to pay a lot of money in Denmark. So we're actually trying to involve the EU Commission because, our neighboring rights, our AI rights are under an EU framework. So we try to involve the Commission because this is a European, it's actually a global issue. And we don't have the time, resources to reinvent the wheel in each member states. And I totally agree with that we need to unite with all the other content creators. And that is also why in our litigation against OpenAI, we have invited, all the other content creators to join forces. We do a lot together also in the EU, also in Denmark. For example, we have joint conference, we write joint op-eds, we write joint concrete proposal to the government and to the EU Commission to showcase that we stand united.
Thank you, Karen. We are 7 minutes ahead of offer, so thank you so much for this conversation. I hope we learn a lot from this panelists. Big round of applause. Thank you so much.